We are very excited. This is the second call where we have changed our format a little bit so that instead of handling sort of council business on these monthly calls, we're really trying to provide members with practical experience, information, as well as some case studies around how people are doing practice with community psychology. And so today's special guest is Dr. Leonard Jason, as I mentioned before, and there's a lot happening right now with regard to CFS-ME. And with that, Dr. Jason, what would you like in terms of your practice work in this area?
Okay, an article just came out in American Journal of Community Psychology, and it really had to do with the decision of to serve or not to serve on the Institute of Medicine, which was a panel that was put together in 2015 to basically name and to come up with a new clinical case definition. And I decided not to be part of that panel. And that has caused all types of issues that have come up that I tried to explain. And let me maybe give a little context. And I did send that article around, but for those of you who haven't had a chance to look at it, I was involved for about 25 years doing basic research on case definitions as well as the name. So you would figure that if I spend all this time doing basic research, if the Institute of Medicine is coming up with this really important panel, I would want to be part of it because I know probably as much as anyone about psychometrics and psychodiagnostic issues and case definitions because I have many, many publications on this. When I started in this field, they were basically saying that this illness was extremely rare. The Centers for Disease Control said that it was primarily a women yuppie flu type illness. And in a sense, it had a lot of stigma associated with it. And the basic epidemiology I thought was flawed. I did a community-based study. It took me 10 years to work on that, to get the funding, to do the research. Although I'm not an epidemiologist, I had them on the team as a community psychologist. I was able to put together multiple disciplines. Eventually, in 1999, 2000, we came up with our estimates that rather than 20,000 people, probably over 1 million people had this illness. And that was very significant for a number of reasons because it made people take notice. So I was very involved in not just trying to understand prevalence, but also the trivial name, chronic fatigue syndrome. If you call this thing chronic cough syndrome, people would say, who cares? But if you call it chronic fatigue syndrome, people also say, who cares? If you called it something like bronchitis or chronic emphysema, more medically sounding name, it probably would mean something. So we've done basic research on names, and before chronic fatigue syndrome, this was actually called myalgic encephalomyelitis. And when we compared that name, saying ME, to CFS, the attributions changed dramatically based on medical interns and college students. I also did basic work on the case definition, and the case definition that was developed in 1994, called the Fukuda criteria, was very interesting. You had to have 8 symptoms. It was called polythetic. You could choose 4 out of the 8, but you could miss the 3 primary symptoms of this illness and still be called having the illness. So the case definition was completely flawed, and I wrote quite a few articles indicating problems with it. So given that I had a background in the case definition, given that I had publications, given that I had published epidemiological research, given that I had published research on the name and what a name might be, here a commission comes together that's going to be a defining moment for the field. They ask me to be a member, and I say no. That's kind of an interesting response. So you really have to think about why you would refuse that, particularly if you're a community psychologist and you want to influence policy. And matter of fact, this very week, I've had discussions with a woman named Billy Moore, who was very instrumental in having us do research on mortality. And she had a discussion with me privately on email. She's a good friend of mine. And I published with her on mortality. Her son died of this illness. And that's why she wanted to do mortality and find out how many people actually did die of this illness. And she kind of, went through again, this is a couple years later, why I didn't serve on that committee, feeling like I made a mistake. I should have been there. And I gave her my explanation of why. I decided to not be part of it. And I might add that this controversy continues today as to a new name they came up with, which was totally inappropriate, called SEID, Systemic Exertion Intolerance Disease. I mean, people just don't like it. And also criteria that are completely flawed. So had I been able to be part of this committee, and by the way, I knew most of the people on this committee. Many of them were friends of mine. I would get phone calls from them, and they would ask me to come and be part of it. I did give a talk in Washington before the committee where I gave my analysis of what needed to be done. I might add that they followed a lot of my recommendations in their report, but they missed some real critical issues. And at a later point, when they wrote the report up, they asked if I would read it and give comments. I refused to do that also, because if my name was connected as a reader, people would think I was endorsing it. What they did was basically antithetical to all the principles of community psychology, the process and the outcome. And that's why I would refuse to be part of it. Even though I might have been able to make a difference, I might have been able to correct some of the problems. I certainly would have opposed them coming up with a ridiculous name that everyone hates, at least the majority of people think is not good. And I certainly would have been able to tell them that they were making some strategic problems with their new case definition. I might add that their new case definition is so broad, and it's a clinical case definition, that includes people with all types of fatigue. And if you include people with all types of fatigue, it's very difficult to find a marker for what we think of as ME, or myalgic encephalomyelitis. ME is not just chronic fatigue. And because chronic fatigue occurs in multiple health conditions, it's also often dealing with people who have lifestyle issues. People with chronic fatigue often sometimes have 3 jobs and other family responsibilities. So there's lots of reasons for having chronic fatigue. What we're talking about is something very different. People, 25% are homebound or bedbound. Now, I might add, just to kind of go to another quick subject, Jen Bria is someone who was going to Harvard, getting her PhD, got sick, and this was around 2013. I had contact with her in 2014, where she basically wanted to set up an advocacy organization to do something about this. And it's really wonderful. She has a film coming out called Unrest. And she interviewed me for the film. But it's really a personal story about her, which is wonderful. And there's a panel discussion that's going to be occurring in Chicago at Facets Multimedia Week from this Sunday. So anybody who happens to be interested in seeing that film, I'll be on a panel which will be discussing that film. But Jen Bria, very interesting, wanted to set up an organization, which she did, called ME Action, which is an advocacy organization. And she asked me to be one of the founding members on the board of directors, which I did join. But then when they found out that their primary mission was going to be raising funds, external funds, and one of the primary things I do is write grants, I felt there was a conflict of interest. So I stepped off that particular organization, but have stayed connected with them in different ways. So let me just kind of give the basic situation once again. The Centers for Disease Control for 25 years set the agenda on this illness called ME and CFS. They underestimated the prevalence, saying that there might be 20,000 people with this illness. They underestimated the kind of ethnic and racial distribution of this illness. It actually occurs more people of color than white people. They basically came up with a case definition that was inappropriate because it didn't require the primary salient symptoms of the illness, which is unrefreshing sleep, cognitive problems, and post-exertional malaise. You could have neither of those three and still be called a case. Well, that's ridiculous. And in addition, they did a lot of work that involved stigma. That was something that patients were really upset. So you had the CDC for 25 years functioning in a way that I think was very harmful for patients, and many patients were very angry at the CDC. You also had the patient organization, the CFIDS Association, that was getting millions of dollars from the CDC. So at one point, the CFIDS Association and something called the Chronic Fatigue Syndrome Advisory Committee were meeting in a sense come up with a new case definition. This was about 15 years ago. And the people at the patient organization called the CFIDS Association were on this committee of 8, of which I was on it. And they were getting millions of dollars from the CDC to brand CFS. Nobody knew that at the time. And yet, basically, we found out that later. And that's one of the reasons that a new name never developed at that time, which was, again, pretty interesting. So you have the patient organization kind of in collusion with the CDC, making for a real significant problem. So here you have, in a sense, the CDC finally has a change in leadership after 25 years and a tremendous amount of patient agitation focused on having that change in leadership. The patient organization has a change in leadership, and they rename the name, and they have a new person. So finally, you've got all the different things lining up, and you say, okay, the Institute of Medicine is coming out with a report, and it's going to try to correct all the abuses of the past. Why would I not want to be part of that committee? And it's very clear that there were several reasons. One is it was a secretive, private process. It was not inclusionary. It was not something that involved all the different gatekeepers. If you come up with a new name, you've got to bring all these different people together. You've got to get the patient, the government, as well as the scientific community on board. You can't just have a panel come up with a name. It's not going to work. That was one problem. The second problem was they were focusing on a clinical case definition, and a clinical case definition is not a research case definition. What the field needs is not 20 different case definitions that exist now, but one that everyone has a consensus on, so that we can have the same case definition used in different laboratories. So when I do basic epidemiology, and I have a very large epidemiology study going on, trying to estimate the prevalence of ME and CFS in pediatrics from 5 to 17 years of age, we need to have one case definition that I can use. I have to use multiple ones now. So the question, if everyone's using a different case definition, how do you compare kind of results across different laboratories? And most importantly, if you have different samples in different sites, because everyone's using different case definitions, ultimately, how are you going to find biological markers? They're too diverse. The samples have to be homogeneous. And that's what I've been calling for. And I knew that if they basically developed a clinical case definition, ultimately, they would use that for research purposes. And matter of fact, in the last half year, someone has published a paper that has basically said, yes, we can use this IOM. It comes out with similar results as a research case definition, which was exactly what I feared. So my fear back in 2013, 2014, when this thing was happening, was that basically, number one, it was going to be exclusionary and not inclusionary. Number two, it was going to focus on the wrong thing, a clinical case definition rather than a research case definition. And those were the primary reasons I decided to stay next to it, watch the process, and then do research with it. When they came out with the report, I basically, within a couple months, was able to analyze data sets using their case definition and find all the flaws in it. And again, had they wanted to, they could have sent it to me. I knew a lot of people on the panel. I could have showed them the problems, but they didn't. And that's the problem. You don't want to have data and findings come out of something that basically isn't empirically based. But that's been what's happened in this field for the last 30 years. Rather than having data driving our decisions, we basically are coming up with decisions and not empirically testing them, which has been my criticism. So that gives you a little bit of a story of both an important movie that's come out right now called Unrest by Bria, my decision not to be part of a Institute of Medicine report that has gotten tremendous publicity. And again, it's been very controversial. There's been a lot of people who both supported my decision not to be part of it. There are a lot of people continuing even this week who basically have contacted me and said, we really wish you had been on that panel because you could have made a difference. I might add that even this week, another organization has formed. It's called MENCFS, and it's a patient organization. And they asked me to be, again, one of the founding members. So it's very exciting to be, so connected with the patient groups, the scientific organization of which I was very involved with, the International Association of Chronic Fatigue Syndrome, ME, and also the federal government, which I was on a federal panel, the Chronic Fatigue Syndrome Advisory Committee. So I've had a chance to meet all the key players. I've been in the field for about 25 years. And I think, in a sense, by knowing the field so well, by doing such basic research, I have been able to elevate myself into a policy position where I get emails and phone calls daily from people from around the world who have asked me for my opinions or my advice or possibilities of working with them. From Norway, where I'm working with the patient registry, to a dissertation in Australia. These are just two things that happened before this call.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. And one of the questions that comes to mind, I think that this is a really important and interesting case study for something that actually happens in practice a lot, which is how do you draw the line between being part of a potential, what is being posed as a solution, and when do you hang back? So like, for example, one of the notes that I wrote down is your decision was not to participate, but there's also sort of this broader question of when do we decide not to practice, in certain contexts. And there's a lot of angst and real trauma that's circulating around issues in race, issues in immigration in this country. And I think that there are a lot of people who are sort of in the same kind of position. They have an opportunity to influence policy in some cases, but when is it detrimental to the ultimate cause to be a part of that practice? And when do you need to take a step back, as you have done in the IOM example, and sort of look from the outside? And so that was kind of what I was taking away from your experience. And so I open it up to reactions from others on the call, or Lenny, your reactions as well.
So Nicole, this is my reaction, and that is that we get involved in an area of our passion, whether it's poverty, whether it's civil rights, whether it's, there's so many movements that many of us are involved in. My area is ME and CFS. And there will be opportunities that come around where we can say, boy, this could really be something that could impact the field. The Institute of Medicine is an incredibly prestigious organization. And when they come out with a white paper, policy paper, it is read around the world. So our instincts are to be involved. And while this is a white paper, this is the IOM, if the same issue comes up at the local level, where something happens and we have to decide, do we want to be part of it? And I'll give you an example of something more at the local level. That also happened this week. You know, a reporter did a story on, and it's put in the title, Chronic Fatigue Syndrome, Do You Have It? And I posted it on my Facebook account, and I had a lot of people, including myself, who said, this is a trivializing title. And there was some good stuff in the article. And I contacted the reporter, and I said, you know, here I am getting involved in doing something that has some harm. And I didn't expect it to have harm. I wouldn't have done it if it had harm, but I did contact the reporter. But a patient kind of went one step further, and she basically contacted the editor of the outlet. And the editor basically said, I'm sorry if we really blew it. Would you like to help write something, and we'll put something in our outlet? I think that was great. And so she's now, not herself, but she's going to get a writer to put another piece in. So there's a borderline between when we decide to work with the media, when we decide to work with the community group, when we decide to work with the Institute of Medicine. And I think what it really comes down to is, if we think that participation, regardless of how big and how policy the implications might be, if we think there is going to be harm associated with that effort, we have to say no. We have to say we refuse to be part of this process. And in that refusal, we are making a very strong statement. And I think we have to be willing to do that, even though there are consequences of doing these things to ourselves professionally. The consequence for the Institute of Medicine was, I thought they were going to do something that was going to harm patients. And in retrospect, I'm absolutely positive that occurred. And I think if I had been part of that panel, I would have been either had to drop off it, or I would have had a fight with all these people. And I knew what the consequence was going to be, because it was not participatory. It was not inclusive. It didn't bring voices in. You can't have a secretive process among an elite group of people that's going to have an influence on a field. And my prediction was it would split the field, and that people would be for it, people would be against it, and that it would be so divisive that it would be better if it did not occur. And that's exactly what I believe has happened.
Are there others on the call who would like to share some experiences that are similar to that, where you had a dilemma of wanting to get involved, having that instinct to get involved, but had to think twice about it?
I don't have an example, but this does bring up an interesting point about community psychology and complexity when it comes to ethics. I think we talk about that in the class, and it always shocks students when we bring up ethics in the community setting, and how, yes, we have to abide by certain things, but then you also have to have a gut instinct, and you have to stay true to your values. You can't compromise your values while you're trying to collaborate. And I think that just highlights that there is this complexity. We're dealing with people, and we're always thinking about unintended consequences of our work. And it's just, there are no clear answers. There is no manual that you can open and say, yes, do this, or no, don't get involved with that. And I'm sure that Lenny also had to struggle, and maybe at sometimes have regretted not joining, but then realize that, in the long run, it is better to not have been a part of that group. It's just, the complexity.
The complexities are very high. And again, and I think whether it's at the local level or the personal level, I'll just give another example at the personal level. I have some friends at Stanford who are doing research. And one of the people who was on the panel, named Lily Chu, is not only an activist, she's a physician, and she also has this illness. And she basically is a good friend. And she basically wrote an article where she basically said, using an instrument I created called the DePaul Symptom Questionnaire, to prove that this panel had actually come up with the good case definition and basically was comparable to any other case definition that was out there. Now, the wild thing is, she's using my instrument and she's publishing an article, and she's a friend, and the other people at Stanford, not only are they friends, but I'm collaborating with them on 2 manuscripts right now, okay, that have to do with quantitative EEG. So look at the complexities. I see something come out that I think is not in the public good. And here's colleagues of mine, one who sat on the Institute of Medicine report, who's a friend who I've done work with and who I continue to do work with, her associates at Stanford. And we're writing some manuscripts now. And I had to decide whether I was going to let that article remain. And I decided to write a rebuttal to it. And I wrote a long rebuttal. And I basically said, she used my instrument incorrectly. The estimates she came up with were not right. And that, in fact, the Institute of Medicine did exactly what I thought it did in terms of being incredibly problematic case definition. I sent this out. It was published. And she sent me a note. And she was certainly hurt that I didn't really have a discussion with her about this before. So again, talking about the personal, when you feel you have to make a statement, I have alienated friends and associates when you take a strong stand towards something, if you believe in it strongly. And do you have an ethical responsibility to fight? Another person at the CDC named Beth Unger came out with a paper in the last year, which basically said a case definition they developed 10 years ago, which I had a major confrontation with them on, because I, again, thought their case definition was totally problematic in the way they implemented it. She basically came out with a new data set saying that there was nothing wrong with that case definition. Again, I wrote a long rebuttal to that particular article that got published. So, again, we need to not only disagree when we think there's a problem, we need to be public about it. We also need to realize that we can alienate very powerful people who have all types of resources that we might want at some point. So all I'm saying is that at the local level, the neighborhood level, the community level, there are value choices in everything we do. And the more we get to know a particular subject area, and the more we know the players, and we know the historical conditions, it's almost like doing an archaeological dig. And as we do that archaeological dig in a particular area, we know it. We know it so well. We have a gut feeling of what's going to happen. We can almost do simulations, and we can say, if you do this, this is the consequence. But to be in that position, you have to really know an area, inside and out, who the players are, who the different positions are, and that takes a real dedication in terms of years of commitment. So trying to study something for a year or two, I don't think does it often. I think, in my experience, working on something for 20 years is the minimum amount of time to be recognized as a player, to be part of that kind of establishment where you can really be going toe-to-toe with anyone and really making a policy difference.
I'd like to point out something else too. Sometimes when someone who is a player in a field gets invited to participate on a panel or to review a report, there's a danger that that person's name and reputation are going to be co-opted to support things that they don't support. Yeah.
Can I just tell you, just a comment on that? When I read the Institute of Medicine report in 2015, I was the most cited person in the entire report. My research had figures in that on my research. The figures talking about how to assess symptoms. My methodology was throughout that report in terms of how you go about doing things. But they got it wrong.
Right.
And they got it so wrong that, in a sense, it's kind of like, if I could make it real simple, before you would have exclusionary illnesses. So in other words, say you had primarily lifestyle factors. You basically, are tired, you're fatigued, you've got, lifestyle issues, maybe, you've got some, whatever that might be causing it by typical American lifestyle. And then you go away to Florida for 2 weeks, then you feel fine. You come back. That's not this illness, okay? But they basically said, if you have these symptoms, it doesn't matter anything else that's going on, you are having this illness they now call SEID, systemic exercise exertion tolerance disease. So in a sense, they took an illness that was a narrow group before, and they exploded the case definition so large that basically it will include 10 times as many people. Well, maybe not 10, but many, many more. We estimate that the prevalence rates will be extremely high. So they made a mistake. They made a terrible mistake because they wanted to make it a clinical. So you say, okay, well, it's a clinical case definition. So what? What's the harm? Because it gets more people than it really has it. The harm is, and this is what's happened, this is really fascinating. In 1994, they developed a research case definition, which then became used as a clinical case definition also. In 2003, another group developed a clinical case definition, which now is being used as a research case definition. So with all this mishmash going on, which is total craziness, I knew that when they developed a clinical case definition in the absence of a research case definition, it would be used as a research case definition. So I guess what I'm saying to you is that when the report came out, my assumption was everybody would assume that I was actually 100% for it because they based a lot of it on my research. So when I basically, the patients thought this was great, the researchers thought this was great, the federal government thought this was great, and I basically said, no,
Not great.
it's not great. There's problems with this thing. I just went, I was like an attack dog. And I'm telling you, I pissed off a lot of people. And I continue to do so. And you know something? That's okay. Because if that's all I do, that's still okay. Because there's an ethical value base for everything I do.
And I can tell you that you're not the only member of SCRA that's had that happen to them. I can think of one EPA white paper that cites an SCRA member extensively throughout the whole thing. And that individual had refused to even be involved in writing it because that person was sure that it would not reflect what she viewed as the lessons to be learned from her research. And that's happened several times. There's people at the point now where, because community psychology perspectives can be so misunderstood, it's extremely difficult to be working on a project and know ahead of time that the product is going to be something that is going to fit your input, that's going to fit something that you want your name on. So it's a really difficult
So Gene, here's what it comes down to. Is the process open? Will the process bring in diverse voices? Is there an effort as the creation is occurring for them to test out ideas potentially with others or even to bring some data into it? Is there an effort to find out who the major gatekeepers feel about the process? If you have those conditions, then that's the way these things should proceed, particularly if it's controversial. particularly if there's years of controversy about people fighting over things like, for example, a case definition or a name, then it becomes even more important for the process to be right. And if the process is wrong right from the start, and again, I really, I'm familiar with the SCRA policy pieces, and I do know that they are a much more open process. And I think that, people can be part of those groups. And I think that, it is possible to not have, I would say that I would not see this, I would not have the same objections to the SCRA policy white papers that have come out that I did to the Institute of Medicine. It was very different. I might add that the Institute of Medicine, just think about it, they were mandated not to talk to anybody during this 1.5-year process. They could not have any dialogue with anybody about what they were doing. That is secretive. That is not collaborative. That is not open. That is not inclusive. And I would not be part of that process.
Well, and I can speak for some of the things that we do here. So I work in a center that does primarily evaluation research. And one of the difficulties that we have is when we work with a partner who may have an agenda, we don't necessarily want to feed that agenda, but we're being asked to evaluate a particular program. And we've had a lot of staff discussions around the report writing. So we'll do the research. We will set the evaluation plan. Everyone has said, yes, this is fine. And then the data comes in and maybe it doesn't support the agenda of the partner that has asked us to do it. Or it supports, it could be used in as Jean said, a co-opted way that supports something else entirely. We've talked internally a lot about, okay, how do we write the results of this in such a way that it can't be co-opted or not easily co-opted in the same way for someone who comes in and decides that they want to use this evaluation data for something other than what we said we would do. And we obviously only do research that is open and inclusive, and we try and protect everybody that we possibly can. But ultimately the partner gets the report and then they can use it the way that they want to use it. Much like once you publish, someone can use that information however they want to use it. And it's a constant battle to make sure that that we are both ethically protecting the people who are a part of the program, but also ethically doing our work as evaluation researchers for that particular partner. And it's hard.
Nicole, I think that's a good example. And I think, Jean, you had a good example too. And, I can just say, we can talk about sort of not being involved, or we could say, how do we get involved appropriately? So let me give kind of another example of the appropriate involvement. When the Institute of Medicine report came out, I contacted 3 mothers who have kids with this illness that represent 3 completely different points of view on this illness. We developed a questionnaire. We basically said, what type name do you think is best? What type case definition would you support? Within like a week, we had 1,000 people that filled out the questionnaire. And then we published it and we circulated it back to the community so that we could, in a sense, take diverse voices, collect data, and then feed it back to people. So that's an example of trying to be an inclusive process as a community psychologist, work with diverse voices, use data to provide information to the community. I might add that an activist in an organization contacted me certainly after the IOM came out and basically said, hey, what are we going to do? This name is terrible, SCID, Systemic Exertion Intolerance Disease. That's not what we have. We have myalgic encephalomyelitis, which is really the name that got stolen from patients by the CDC in 1988 when they renamed the illness. So she said, what can we do? I said, well, why don't you put a survey together? This was before I did this other survey, and she did. And she put a survey together which I helped her develop, and she again got over 1,000 people, and again information developed that was then used to go back into the process to show there was little support for this new name. So I think those are responsible things that we can do. Working with activists, or working ourselves on surveys, or working with them. Those are two examples of things we can do to try to slow down the adoption process of something that I think, in this case, was really not in the best interests of the patients.
Dave, it looked like you might have been trying to dive in there. Did you have something you wanted to add?
Well, I was just, this is an interesting conversation, and I was reflecting a little bit on some of the work that we do, as some other folks have, and I think we do a fair amount of facilitation of community groups that are addressing a variety of different problems, and one of the ongoing conversations that we have is, as a facilitator of that process, do you have an opinion? Not being a member of the community, and personally, the sort of resolution to that I've come to is, you're a much more effective facilitator if you don't have an opinion. That's one sort of school of thought. But I think that the emphasis on sort of an inclusionary process is what's key here, because in those instances, if I can believe that the problem-solving process is inclusionary and diverse and draws on a lot of different perspectives, then I'm actually quite comfortable in facilitating that process and sort of accepting whatever the conclusion or whatever the intervention that the group decides on. So but this is because I have been involved, and I can think of a couple instances where I've been in that position where I've been called upon to facilitate, and I've not been comfortable with the composition of the group or the degree to which the process has included a diverse set of perspectives. So it is truly an ethical question.
Hey, Dave, I can just mention that in this area for 25 years, I have noticed abuses of power from the most powerful people in the area. People who have had incredible prestige and privilege, who have abused that privilege to hurt the interests of patients. And I've watched that process and the sidelines and tried to do my effort to do something. But the one thing I would constantly do is refuse to be part of what I thought was victimization that was occurring. So I do think that we have an ethical role, that whether we're facilitating something or whether we're sort of launching something or whether we're intervening, whichever role we take, I think there's ethical challenges. And I might add that, I think these types of discussions are ones that we probably need more attention toward, because I think this stuff happens all the time. It happens with me all the time. And again, I'm not necessarily saying I have the right answers when I, participate in these processes. What I'm saying is we should be asking the right questions with the right people in the right forums and the right structures. So I constantly come back to saying, is this structure right to sort of solve this issue? And do we have different voices at the table? And in my situation, which is different than yours, Dave's, is I say the government has to be there, the scientific community has to be there, the patient groups have to be there, and they all have to have a stake in this thing. And that's the way you make really progress. And then if you bring them all together, then how do you bring them together? And is it just a one-shot thing where they come up with something, or is it something that's ongoing, where that you can sort of think about something, test it out, bring the data back, and keep working on it? And I think the process is so important to really come up with a solution. And if you don't have the structure and the process right from the beginning, you're sunk.
I would absolutely agree. And in fact, as I sort of reflect on some of the more meaningful work I've done as a community psychologist, it is really around that notion of creating structure and process that is inclusive. And I think that's that is a role that we can fill in these kinds of activities. I mean, in the procedures that we sort of employ, that conversation up front around structure, process, the role of the facilitator, the role of the problem-solving group, and so forth and so on is so important, because that's where you have the opportunity to raise some of these issues. And I'm at this point in my career, have seen this work really well if attention is given to some of those sort of critical issues around process. I've also seen, as Lenny, as you've just suggested, abuses of power and so forth in instances where those procedures have not been well defined or well facilitated. And I tell folks these days, if you're interested in this kind of work, those facilitation skills will pay off, because working with these groups is, I do this several times, depending on the month, but can do this several times over the course of a month, and these issues always come up, around, is the process sufficient to get us to a reasonable solution given whatever the issue is? So I think it behooves us, again, as community psychologists, to really understand these things and learn from these kinds of experiences.
And again,
Dave, I have a question for you.
Sure. I'm sorry, go on.
Yes, for Lenny, for Dave, for everybody on the call, and then just in general, a question. So it goes back to what Dave just said about the skills. Do you think we train our graduate students and prepare them well enough for this? Whether you're going into academia or practice, you still are going through a training program. Do you think, in your experiences, that we're well prepared? Do you have to learn it on your own? Can you prepare somebody, or is it something that you have to be in a situation to truly understand? And what can we do to prepare our students better?
So I'll tell you about my experience. I have a professional degree in planning, and went to graduate school in community psychology, and don't get me wrong, my graduate education in both cases was really good, and I gained a lot of value from that. But I never was introduced to the idea of facilitating, believe it or not, facilitating in the way that I facilitate now. I in a practice role, once I was out practicing and had a job, I got sent off to be trained to be a facilitator, and it was probably the most valuable, or one of the most valuable, training experiences I've ever been through. It was a week-long 9 to 5 kind of a deal, where this particular individual was training a whole group of facilitators, and I used that skill literally, if not weekly, at least monthly. So yeah, I think, and I of course I got trained a long time ago, so I don't know if that's still the case or not, but that idea of sort of learning that skill as an applied skill was not part of my graduate education.
So Dave, I went to school a little bit before you, and I think that, but I have been involved in a training institution for a number of years, and I'm familiar with some other training programs, and I don't think we address this issue as well as we could. And for me, it really comes down to one of power and abuse of power, and many different kind of groups that I've worked with, the MECFS being one example. The abuses of power that I have seen have been enormous, that go on for decades. And I don't think any of us kind of really are prepared for the abuses that we see kind of occurring, and how we basically deal with them in an ethical way. And when we have to just wait, and sometimes waiting for 10 years, waiting for 20 years. I mean, I had to wait 20 years for some of these people to change leadership so that more appropriate people came to be in power. And again, my sense is that the training that we need to understand kind of the patients, the power abuses, the community coalitions, and the ethical issues, and how we can use data to possibly solve some of these issues, and how we can sort of really look at small wins, keep us motivated and not give up. But I do think that we could probably do a better job with basically talking about these structural issues that I think face everything we do when we leave the university. And matter of fact, the same things occur within the university as outside the university. It's just a different setting.
Right. I do want to be sensitive to time because everybody's time is precious, but I thought I would ask Carlos real quick. Since you are embarking on your graduate career, what is your sense of how facilitation and some of the dealing with the abuses of power that Lenny talked about, is that something you're seeing in some of your instruction, Carlos, or no?
Not as a training. The conversation will arise in class when looking at various topics. Power will be definitely something that we'll be talking about and reflect on based on current events. But a specific training and knowing exactly how and what to do is something that I think it's very valuable. Even just recently, we were looking into training on conflict resolution, and we were looking at that as something very valuable. So definitely the Summer Institute could be a way of graduate students gaining this great skills.
Yes, and more about the Summer Institute will be coming out soon. But that's an interesting direction to look at. Okay, well, so the name of the film is Unrest, and are there other distribution channels that are picking that up, Lenny, that people could see?
Yeah, it's going to be actually on PBS. Kind of, it'll be coming out, but it's in theaters, and one of the things that's really very pleasing for me, and again, I know this woman, Jen Bria, very well, is that the mortality statistics that she talks about, the focus on people dying, that's been research that we've been doing for like 10 years. And that came from patients asking us to do that research. The statistics that she cites on prevalence are data that we basically came up with. So to sort of see a film that's throughout the film, when they're talking about data, they're really referring to stuff that came out of our shop. It was very gratifying because it shows that we have the respect of not just the scientific community, but the patient community. And that's very reassuring to say that, in our work, we have made a difference.
That's awesome. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining the call today. This has really been a wonderful, productive conversation. And thank you, Dr. Jason, for joining us and agreeing on relatively short notice to come and speak with us today.